Brian was a rancher, but poor was a word that clung to him like the dry earth to his boots. His ranch, once a source of pride, was now a testament to hard times. The fences sagged, the barn paint peeled, and the herd was a shadow of what it used to be. Every sunrise brought the same gnawing worry, how to keep it all afloat, how to care for the few animals he had left. He ran a hand over his rough, weather-beaten face, the stubble scratching his palm. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful display that seemed to mock his struggles. He had worked this land for 20 years, pouring his sweat and soul into it, but lately it felt like the land was slowly taking it all back. He watched a hawk circle lazily overhead, a picture of freedom he desperately envied. One particularly bleak evening, as the sun bled its final colours across the vast sky, a sound cut through the usual quiet symphony of the prairie. It was faint at first, a mournful whinny, but it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the old, dilapidated barn at the far end of the property. Brian knew that barn. It was a relic, almost forgotten, a place where tools rusted and memories gathered dust. He hadn't been inside it for years. The structure itself was an eyesore, its wooden planks warped and greyed by countless seasons of sun and rain. Some of the roofing panels were missing, leaving jagged holes that offered glimpses of the darkening sky. It stood hunched and silent most of the time, a forgotten sentinel. But tonight it was alive with sound. The sound was undeniably a horse, and it wasn't a happy sound. It was a sound of deep distress, a guttural cry that seemed to vibrate with pain and fear. It tugged at something primal in Brian's soul, a deep ache of empathy that he tried to ignore most days, but couldn't now. He paused in his weary trek back to his small, lonely farmhouse, his hand resting on the worn latch of the main pasture gate. He strained to hear over the rising evening wind, which rustled through the dry grass and whistled around the skeletal remains of an old windmill. This wasn't just any horse. This sounded like a desperate plea for help, a cry that pierced through his usual stoicism and landed squarely in his heart. A question formed in his mind, heavy with foreboding and a touch of dread. What could be making a horse cry out like that, all alone in the dark of that old, forgotten barn? It wasn't his horse. All his remaining animals were accounted for, safely in their usual pens and pastures. He had a handful of aging cows, a couple of work horses that were more bone than muscle, and a flock of scrawny chickens. None of them were anywhere near the old barn. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, despite the lingering warmth of the day. Was it a stray? Had some animal gotten trapped? The sound was too raw, too full of anguish to be anything ordinary. It was a sound that spoke of suffering, of a deep, profound sorrow that Brian knew all too well. He couldn't ignore it. His upbringing, his very nature, wouldn't allow it. Even in his own struggles, he couldn't turn his back on another living creature in pain. He had to know. He took a deep breath, the dry air filling his lungs, and started walking towards the barn. Each step crunched on the gravel path, a stark contrast to the urgent, animalistic cries echoing in the distance. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. A familiar companion these days, but this was different. This was not the dull ache of financial worry. This was a sharp, immediate concern for another's well-being. The horse's sorrowful cries seemed to pull him forward, a siren call of distress that he couldn't resist. He walked past the corrals where his own horses grazed, their heads lifting briefly, their ears twitching towards the sound. They seemed calm, unbothered. That confirmed it wasn't one of his. The old barn was at the very edge of his property, a structure that had been there long before Brian bought the ranch. It had been deemed unsafe years ago, its foundation questionable, its timbers riddled with rot. Brian had meant to tear it down, to clear the land, but he never had the money or the manpower. It was a place he usually avoided, a symbol of decay. Now it was the source of a desperate sound that had drawn him out into the twilight. As he got closer, the cries became more distinct, more heart-wrenching. He could hear The snorting, the ragged breaths, the desperate sounds of a creature trapped or injured. His pace quickened, the worn leather of his boots kicking up dust. The air grew cooler as he approached the shadow of the barn. The barn loomed before him, a dark, imposing shape against the fading light. Its massive doors, made of thick, heavy wood, were slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper darkness visible within. The sound seemed to be coming from just beyond those doors. He could feel the vibrations of the horse's distress, even from here. He reached the barn doors, pushing one open with a groan of protesting wood. The hinges, long neglected, shrieked in protest. The interior of the barn was even darker than he expected, thick with the scent of old hay, dust, and something else. Something vaguely animalistic, but with an undertone of decay. Shadows danced in the dim light, filtering through the holes in the roof. He squinted, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. Stacks of forgotten farming equipment, rusted tools, and decaying bales of hay were piled haphazardly against the walls. It was a graveyard of sorts, for things that had once been useful. And then he saw it. In the far corner of the barn, illuminated by a weak shaft of moonlight piercing through a gaping hole in the roof, was a horse. It was a beautiful creature, a mare, with a coat the colour of polished mahogany, but she was in terrible condition. Her ribs were starkly visible beneath her skin, her coat was matted and dull, and she was trembling, violently. Her large dark eyes were wide with fear and pain, reflecting the meagre light like pools of liquid sorrow. She was lying down, tangled in something, her struggle making the desperate sounds Brian had heard. The sheer misery radiating from the animal was overwhelming. Brian felt a pang of guilt for not investigating sooner, for letting this creature suffer in silence on his land. He took a cautious step forward, his voice soft, trying not to startle her further. "Easy now, girl," he murmured, his voice raspy with disuse and emotion. "Easy. I'm here to help." The mare flinched at the sound, her head snapping towards him, a fresh wave of whinnies and distressed snorts erupting from her. It was clear she was terrified, perhaps of everything, perhaps of him. But the sound that emerged was not just fear. It was a cry that seemed to carry the weight of 1,000 hardships. Brian continued to speak to her, his voice a low, steady rumble, trying to convey reassurance. He took another slow step, his eyes scanning the barn floor around the distressed animal. He needed to see what was wrong, what was trapping her, what was causing her such agony. What he would find inside was about to change everything, not just for this animal, but for him too. The realization settled in his gut, a premonition of a turning point. He just didn't know how profound that turning point would be. He moved closer, his heart aching with every whinny, ready to face whatever lay hidden in the darkness of the old barn. The air was thick with anticipation, with the palpable suffering of a creature in need, and the quiet resolve of a man who, despite his own poverty, could not turn away. This moment, standing on the threshold of despair and potential salvation, was a crossroads he had to cross. The horse cried out again, a desperate, pleading sound, and Brian took another determined step forward into the heart of the old barn's mystery and sorrow. The darkness seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Brian approached the mare slowly, his worn boots making little sound on the packed dirt floor. He kept his movements deliberate, his hands visible, showing he meant no harm. "Easy now, girl," he repeated, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "Just want to see what's troubling you." The horse's breath came in ragged gasps, and her body still trembled. He could see now that her hind leg was caught in something. It was a section of old, rusted barbed wire fence, tangled with a heavy, decaying wooden beam. It looked like a piece of the barn's old structure had finally given way, crashing down and trapping her. The wire was embedded deep in her flesh, and the beam pinned her hindquarters, preventing her from standing. A wave of anger mixed with pity washed over Brian. Who would leave a horse in such a state? Or had it been an accident? The barn was full of hazards, but this seemed deliberate. The thought sent a cold dread through him. He knelt down carefully, a few feet away from her head, speaking to her constantly. "You're a strong one, aren't you? We'll get you out of this. Just gotta be patient." The mare's large eyes followed his movements, and for a moment, Brian thought he saw a flicker of understanding, a desperate plea for release. Her coat, he now noticed, was not just dull. It was caked with dried mud and what looked suspiciously like blood. He could see small wounds on her flank and shoulder where debris had likely scraped her. The barbed wire was the worst. It was a cruel, rusty trap, biting into her flesh with every desperate attempt to free herself. He could see the raw, torn skin, the dark blood staining her mahogany coat. It was a grim sight, a testament to prolonged suffering. He knew he couldn't just yank her free. That would only cause more damage, more pain. He needed to assess the situation, to figure out how to cut or move the beam and untangle the wire without inflicting further injury. He scanned the barn, his eyes falling on a pile of discarded tools. There was a rusty saw, a pair of old bolt cutters that looked like they might still work, and a crowbar. The crowbar looked promising. If he could get enough leverage under the beam, he might be able to lift it enough for her to pull her leg free. The bolt cutters were essential for the wire. "All right, girl," he said, standing up slowly. "Gonna get some tools. Be right back. Don't you worry." He gave her a reassuring nod, though he knew she was just a horse. But he felt a connection forming, a shared moment of vulnerability in this desolate place. He moved quickly, his farmer's instincts kicking in. He found the bolt cutters, their jaws stiff but functional, and the crowbar heavy and solid. He also grabbed a thick, old canvas tarp from a corner, thinking it might be useful to protect her or to help move her later, should it come to that. He returned to the mare's side, his heart pounding with a mixture of apprehension and resolve. This was going to be difficult. He laid the tools down beside him, keeping his voice low and calm. "Okay, let's see what we've got here." He carefully approached her hindquarters, his eyes fixed on the tangled mess. The beam was heavy, rough-hewn wood, and it lay across her leg at an awkward angle. The barbed wire was wound around it and her leg, creating a cruel knot. He gently tried to push the beam, but it was too heavy to budge significantly. The mare let out a pained whinny and struggled slightly, her eyes rolling back. Brian immediately stopped, backing away. "Whoa, easy girl, I know it hurts, just trying to help." He decided to tackle the wire first. It was thinner than the beam and potentially easier to cut. He carefully maneuvered the bolt cutters, trying to find a section of wire that he could snip without getting too close to her skin. The wire was thick, rusted, and unforgiving. He squeezed the handles with all his might. The cutters groaned, but they bit into the metal. With a sharp snap, one strand broke. The mare flinched, but the sound of relief was palpable in her next breath. Brian worked methodically, cutting one strand at a time, his muscles straining with the effort. Each snip was a small victory, a step closer to freeing her. He focused on the parts of the wire that seemed to be digging into her most, trying to alleviate the immediate pressure. He cut several lengths of wire, carefully pulling them away so they wouldn't snag her again. It was slow, painstaking work. The mare seemed to understand, or at least she became calmer, her trembling subsiding slightly as the tension on her leg lessened. Her breathing evened out a little. Brian dared to hope. He was making progress. He could see the wound more clearly now, a deep gash where the wire had cut into her muscle. It was bad, but it wasn't as if the bone was exposed, so that was a small mercy. He continued to cut and carefully pull away the loosened wires, creating more space. Once he felt he had removed as much of the wire as he could safely manage, he turned his attention to the beam. It was still pinning her leg, preventing her from standing. He picked up the crowbar, its metal cold against his calloused hands. He wedged the curved end of the crowbar beneath the edge of the heavy beam, close to where it rested on her leg. He braced himself, planting his feet firmly on the dirt floor. "Okay, girl, this is the hard part," he warned her softly. "Gonna try and lift this. You gotta stay as still as you can." He pushed down on the end of the crowbar, putting all his weight into it. The beam creaked, groaning under the pressure. Brian grunted, his back muscles screaming. Slowly, agonizingly, the beam began to lift just a few inches. It was enough. "Now!" he yelled, though his voice was strained. "Pull your leg!" The mare, sensing her chance, gathered her strength. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled her hind leg free from the gap he had created. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling, her injured leg held at an awkward angle. She was free, but she was clearly in pain, favoring the injured limb. She took a few wobbly steps away from the now dislodged beam and the tangled wire, her body still shaking. She turned and looked back at Brian, her big dark eyes no longer filled with terror, but with a mixture of pain and something else, something that looked remarkably like gratitude. Brian watched her, his chest tight with emotion. He had done it. He had freed her, but the ordeal wasn't over. She was injured, weak, and alone. He looked at her, then around the dusty dark barn. This was no place for a creature in pain. He had to get her out of here, and he had to tend to her wounds. He noticed, as she shifted her weight, that a small tarnished silver locket was caught on a piece of her matted mane, dangling near her ear. It was an odd thing to find on a seemingly abandoned horse. This detail, the locket, sparked a new wave of questions. How did she get here? Who did she belong to? And why was she left to suffer? The mystery deepened, adding another layer to the already heavy atmosphere of the old barn. Brian knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was no ordinary stray. This was a horse with a story, and somehow he had stumbled right into the middle of it. He looked at the horse, then at the locket glinting faintly in the dim light, and a new sense of purpose alongside his old worries began to form. He had saved her life, but her story and the secrets it held were just beginning to unfold. He needed to get her to a safe place, to clean her wounds, and to try and unravel the mystery of her presence and her suffering. He realized then that the dilapidated barn, a symbol of his own fading fortunes, had become the stage for an unexpected drama, a drama involving a suffering animal and a hidden past. The weight of her pain and the questions it raised settled on his shoulders, a burden he was now, inexplicably, willing to carry. He offered her a gentle, reassuring smile, a silent promise that he wouldn't abandon her. The locket, a small, unassuming object, felt like a clue, a breadcrumb leading him further into the unknown. He had to follow. He had to find out. He had to understand. This horse, this creature of profound sorrow, had somehow become his responsibility. Brian gently stroked the mare's neck. She leaned into his touch, a soft sigh escaping her. The locket, still caught in her mane, was cold against his fingers as he carefully worked it free. It was small, tarnished silver, engraved with a delicate floral pattern. He opened it with a fingernail. Inside, faded with time, were two tiny sepia-toned photographs. One was of a stern-looking older woman, her face etched with hardship, but her eyes held a glint of kindness. The other was of a younger woman, her features soft, her smile a shy, wistful thing. Brian felt a pang of deep sadness. This wasn't just a stray horse. This was a creature with a past, a connection to people who had clearly loved her, and who had, for some reason, lost her. He knew he couldn't leave her there. He guided her slowly out of the barn, the evening air now cool and still. She limped noticeably, favoring her injured leg, but she followed him, her trust slowly blooming with each step. He led her to a small, unused paddock near his farmhouse, one with a sturdy, if weathered fence that offered a bit more protection than the open fields. He found some fresh water and a small amount of hay, which he placed within her reach. She drank deeply, her thirst seemingly unquenchable, before cautiously nibbling at the hay. Brian watched her, a weary satisfaction spreading through him. He had intervened. He had offered a lifeline. Over the next few days, Brian dedicated himself to the mare's recovery. He cleaned and dressed her wounds with the limited supplies he had, his movements gentle and sure. He spent hours just sitting with her, talking to her, letting her grow, accustomed to his presence. He named her Hope, a small defiance against the bleakness that had settled over his life. Hope's legs slowly began to heal, the limp becoming less pronounced. She still bore the scars of her ordeal, both visible and invisible, but the terror in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet curiosity and a growing affection for the rancher who had rescued her. The locket became Brian's quiet obsession. He spent his evenings poring over the faded photographs, trying to piece together a story. He showed them to his few remaining neighbours, but no one recognized the women. The old barn, they said, had been abandoned for decades, a forgotten structure from a time before Brian even owned the ranch. It was rumoured to have belonged to an old widow named Eleanor Vance, who had lived there with her daughter, Clara, many years ago. Vance had been a reclusive woman, known for her love of horses. Clara had supposedly left the area abruptly after a tragedy, and no one knew what had become of her. The pieces started to fit, forming a picture of loss and abandonment. Brian imagined Clara, a young woman with a gentle smile, and her beloved horse, perhaps this very mare. He pictured her leaving, perhaps forced to, and the horse being left behind, trapped and forgotten in the derelict barn. The thought was unbearable. He felt a profound connection to Clara, to her unspoken sorrow, to the horse that had carried her legacy. His own struggles, his own poverty seemed to pale in comparison to the depth of loss implied by the locket and the mare's emaciated state. As hope grew stronger, Brian found a renewed sense of purpose. Caring for her, tending to her wounds, and protecting her from further harm gave him a reason to get up each morning. It was a small spark of light in his otherwise solitary existence. He realized that sometimes the greatest riches aren't measured in dollars and cents, but in the quiet acts of kindness, in the bonds formed with those in need. His ranch was still struggling, the bills still piled up, but his heart felt fuller than it had in years. Hope was more than just a horse. She was a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, something beautiful could endure and even flourish. He began to explore the possibility of finding Clara or her descendants. He knew it was a long shot, a needle in a haystack, but the thought of reuniting Hope with her family, or at least bringing some closure, spurred him on. He started making inquiries in neighbouring towns, visiting county archives, looking for any trace of Eleanor or Clara Vance. It was a daunting task, one that required time and resources he barely had. But the image of Clara's shy smile in the locket and the grateful look in Hope's eyes gave him the strength to persevere. He understood now that Hope's crying from the old barn wasn't just a cry of pain. It was a cry from the past, a plea for remembrance, a desperate signal that she had not been forgotten. This experience had profoundly changed Brian. He had entered the old barn expecting to find nothing but decay and perhaps a stray animal. He had found instead a creature burdened by a history of neglect and sorrow, and in saving her, he had inadvertently saved a part of himself. He had rediscovered his capacity for compassion, his innate desire to protect the vulnerable. The poverty that had weighed him down for so long felt less crushing now. He still had his challenges, his struggles were far from over, but he had hope, and hope, in turn, had brought him a renewed sense of his own worth. He looked at her, now grazing peacefully in the paddock, a picture of dawning health and contentment, and a soft smile touched his lips. He had no idea what the future held, whether he would find Clara or if Hope would ever truly recover from her past. But he knew one thing for certain: he would not give up on her. He would care for her, protect her, and do his best to honor the memory of the woman whose locket she carried. This is where your story comes in. Brian's journey is far from over, and the mysteries of the old barn and the Vance family are waiting to be unraveled. What do you think Brian should do next? What would you do if you found a horse like Hope, carrying such a poignant memento of a lost past? We believe in the power of community and shared stories. If this tale of resilience and unexpected hope resonated with you, please consider liking this video and sharing it with your friends. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. And if you want to follow Brian and Hope on their journey, to see if they uncover the secrets of the old barn and the Vance family, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We'll be bringing you more updates on their progress and their quest for answers. What are your thoughts on the locket and the photos inside? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one and love to hear your perspectives. Your engagement helps us understand what stories matter to you. And we're always looking for ways to improve and bring you more content that touches your heart and sparks your curiosity. Thank you for being a part of our community.